Thank you very much, General. Muito bom dia a todos. Bom dia. Just testing. My next presentation, hopefully, not promising, hopefully will be in Portuguese. But I'm very happy to be here in front of you this morning to talk about maritime security. General Porter is absolutely right. Maritime security is something that we all in Africa should be concerned about. And let me say right off the bat, no African should ignore this dimension of security. The reason being that we're all islanders. All Africans are islanders. Because when you look at the map of Africa, this is no geography lesson, but look at the map of Africa, and what do you see? Look closely. What do you see? You see a fact that oftentimes escapes us, and that is the fact that Africa is surrounded by water. Africa is surrounded by water. To the north, we have the Mediterranean. To the east, we have the Indian Ocean. To the west, we have the Atlantic. Isn't it? We are fully surrounded by water. And when you're surrounded by water, you're an island. And if you live on an island and you ignore the maritime components of your existence, if you're living on an island and you ignore the water that surrounds you, well, chances are that you will be making major strategic mistakes again and again and again, because you'll be ignoring a very important dimension of your existence, and therefore a very important dimension of your security. And guess what? This is what we as Africans have done again and again and again. The focus of our security and development has been on the land. The focus of our security and development has been on the land, ignoring the maritime dimension. Just parenthetically, you got all sorts of future leaders, and many of you already are leaders. If you look at your budget, your security budget, I'm just going to guess as to which service gets the lion's share of the budget. The Navy. See the response? Laughter. The response is laughter when I say the Navy. Because it's ridiculous. It's not the Navy. And you say Air Force. Again, not the Air Force. Nobody's laughing. But people should be laughing as well. Not the Air Force. It's the what? The Army. Yeah? The Army gets the lion's share. Sometimes up to 3/4 of the budget goes to the Army. Okay? And this is and I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm just stating a fact. And the reason why the budgets of the security sector are composed that way is because the assumption is that the threats are land-based. That's the assumption. Because we expect the threats to emanate from the land, well, this is how we allocate our resources. And what I like to argue is that this is problematic. because he ignores the fact that we are one big, massive island. So when we, as military leaders, when we as security leaders conceive of security, it is important not to neglect that dimension, because there could be dangers, there could be threats incubating in those domains. It's important that we know them. It's important that we understand them so that we can at least be prepared for the threats that potentially emanate from them. My argument is that the maritime domains of Africa are central to Africa's future. Very much central to Africa's future. However, it's important that we understand how they affect today the African expectations for both security and development. And as we've been discussing here for the last week or so, the way we should define security should be broader, beyond the military, beyond the defense aspects of security, to touch on the human dimension of security. When we talk about the human dimension of security, it's about the things that enable the citizen to have a good, dignified life. And first and foremost, I would argue we should put food security at the very top of our preoccupations if we are, in fact, going to pursue the human security agenda. Now, when we talk about food in Africa, we are talking about fish. When we are talking about food in Africa, we simply cannot ignore the contribution that fish gives to that food security aspect. About 200 million Africans depend on fish as their key protein intake. 200 million. And about 10 million depend on fisheries for their livelihood, their income. So it's very, very important that we look at the maritime domains, we understand the maritime domains, we control the maritime domains, and we protect them. Because at stake is the food security for our people. If we had the time, we could talk about other issues like wind and so on and so forth that in the future will really turn Africa into a big player as far as the maritime domain is concerned. But for the purposes of our current discussion, let's just focus on the top priorities. If you look at the threats to the maritime security, if you look at the threats to the maritime domain in Africa, at the very top of the list, we should put IUU fishing. And IUU is just an acronym for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. I'm going to talk about this in just a second. But there are other priorities from an African perspective. Human smuggling and trafficking in persons is also something that we should be concerned about. Smuggling, whether we're talking about narcotics, weapons, or other contraband. Another big issue. Piracy. If you ask a Western security expert to list the threats facing Africa's maritime domain, they probably put piracy at the very top. But from an African perspective, piracy is important, but certainly should not be at the top of the list. And then port security. I want to take a few minutes to talk about some of these issues in a bit greater detail. Fishing. This is one big global problem. IUU fishing is a massive global problem. Estimated losses between 10 to 24, $25 billion per year. This is money that governments lose due to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. The estimates for Africa, most scholars, most researchers place this at about 1 billion. I think this is an underestimate. I think this is a gross underestimate. Because, and I'll show you the slide in just a second. The fact of the matter is, African governments do not control their waters. So there's no way they can actually ascertain for sure the amount of illegal catch that's being extracted from their waters. They don't have the resources to do that, or they have not deployed the resources to do that. So these figures are, in my view, not only outdated, because I've been seeing these figures like $1 billion a year for many, many years. The figures do not go up or down. They remain stable. I don't trust the figures very much, but these are the figures that you'll hear when the issue of illegal fishing comes up, that Africa is losing about $1 billion per year. Now, recently, there was a study done just on China. The Chinese contributions to illegal fishing worldwide, including Africa. When you look at the map, you see where the Chinese are getting the fish. Okay, I know that is a massive problem. You see where the Chinese are getting the fish. These figures demonstrate that the data that we've been using for many years to highlight IUU fishing in Africa, I think we've been underestimating it by a factor of about 12. Okay? By a factor of 12. So this is what this particular slide shows. Now, I'll tell you a story. I once was I do a lot of, as General Puda said, I do a lot of work on maritime security. In fact, I'd say about 50% of my time is dedicated to this. I once was in Senegal, my sister's beautiful country. I was in Senegal. So I was with the Navy captain at the beach. So the Navy captain was telling me about, all of the issues pertaining to food, especially fishery insecurity in Senegal. And he was telling me that Senegal was on the verge of importing fish. You just imagine. Senegal was on the verge of importing fish. And I was saying, well, Captain, you have a problem. You have a problem. Because fish in Senegal is not just food, it's culture. It's culture. And I said, well, do you know what kind of food, what kind of fish you are importing? Are you sure that is the kind of quality that you get from Senegalese waters? And I told him, look, the minute the Senegalese understand that they no longer have fish, you're going to have a massive security problem in your hands. You're going to have a massive security problem in your hands. So there's a very direct connection between fish and insecurity. Now, people will be rioting on the streets. And understanding that, one of my understanding is that one of the very first actions that President Macky Sall took upon taking office was to suspend all fishing licenses for the foreign fleet. Okay, suspend all of it, and let's very carefully look at how we've been going about providing licenses to foreign vessels, because they are completely devastating the fisheries. So there is a very, very direct connection between fish and security. Because we do not control the waters that surround our continent, we have no idea that very important smuggling routes traverse the waters and impact our security. Human smuggling is one of the biggest problems that Africa confronts right now. A lot of migrants leave from around the continent, take to the waters to find a better life in other parts of the world, especially in Europe. And the number of deaths that this involves is completely staggering. I spent a year in Spain back in the mid-2000s, and it was incredible. Every single day, the Spanish news media will carry reports of another boat, another would-be number of migrants that drowned, making the cross, or attempting to make the cross into Europe. If we had better control over the waters that surround Africa, certainly we would be able to control this tragedy a bit. This is a major tragedy that we should, as African leaders, be very much aware of. Trafficking in persons, which is related to this human smuggling, is a big business. Trafficking in persons, the total value of this trade is about $30+ billion. So there's a lot of money. So you can understand how people will go to Africa and engage in this illegal, illicit trade. And again, it's because we do not have domain awareness. It's because we do not control the waters that this is allowed to take place. Narcotics, another big issue when it comes to maritime security. Well, the first official narco state is in Africa. The very official narco state is in Africa. For reasons that we understand so well, this particular West African state is basically being taken over by narco traffickers. Drugs coming from the Americas, they park there before they make their way north to Europe. When we first started working on this a few years ago, I would talk to African security leaders, and they would tell me, well, Professor, this is not our problem. This is not our problem. I say, why is it not our problem? I say, well, you're an African yourself. You know we don't do cocaine. You know, this is a white person's drug. Well, when I go back to Africa now, it is not just a white person's drug. About 10 to 15% of all the cocaine that goes through Africa stays there. About 10 to 15% of all of the cocaine that goes through Africa stays there, and that number is increasing. That number is increasing. So expect, and again, using Senegal as an example, I was with another officer going around, and he was, well, Professor, we are a poor country. And I thought, well, you're not a poor country, but anyway, you know, what's your point? And so how do you explain all of these big mansions here? It's not industry. Well, how do you explain all of this? I said, well, you know the answer better than I do. Okay? So this is a big issue. This is a big issue. For me, from an economist perspective, one of the biggest problems with drug money is that it distorts the economy completely. It distorts all of the systems of incentives and disincentives in the economy. So why should I spend hours and hours and hours growing, I don't know, pick your crop, corn or potatoes or whatever, okay? And at the end of the year, at the end of the harvest season, earn, say, $5,000. That same $5,000 I could probably make in a week if I engage in this narcotics business. This is a big, big, big issue. The other issue is that from an institutional perspective, it corrodes institutions more like anything else. Drug money, it's incredible. It's incredible the damage that narcotics does to institutions. Whether you're talking about ports, airports, you know, you name it. It's just almost an irresistible, it's just easy money. So we have to be very, very careful in making sure that this does not pose the same problems that we saw in other parts of the world. Because if we don't put an end to this, what you see in the Americas is what's going to be in Africa, the reality in Africa in about 10, 20 years max. You know, just look at Mexico. Just look at Mexico. To just pick one country. The security forces in Mexico are having a very hard time. Very, very hard time just keeping the drug lords at bay. The other issue that I want to talk about is piracy. And the title really should be Piracy and Armed Robbery at Sea. The reason why we should look at both is piracy is an international concern, is an international problem. And it really refers to criminal acts beyond your territorial waters. You know, so you have your 12 nautical miles. Beyond the 12 nautical miles, the criminal activity that takes place there, of the type that we'll be describing in a minute, is considered piracy. Within your territorial waters is considered armed robbery at sea. And armed robbery at sea is dealt with mainly using domestic national instruments. Armed robbery at sea is not is not an international concern. Piracy is. Piracy is an international concern. And let me start with piracy. And this is what we saw off the Horn of Africa beginning in the mid-2000s, around 2004, 2005, as a result of the collapse of the Somali state. A lot of people don't remember that the Somalia used to be a state with a naval force. Somalia used to be a state with a naval force. The state collapses, institutions like the Navy collapse. Two things happen. First of all, those who are stealing the fish can now roam Somali waters undeterred. And those Somalis who wanted to engage in criminal activity at sea could also do so. So the result of that, and by the way, the Somali pirates, very media savvy, they made the argument that the reason why they went about hijacking ships was to protect their territorial waters. That was the argument. That they were engaged in self-defense. And everybody has a right to do that. So why should all of these countries come and steal fish from our waters and us doing nothing? So we had to do something. Well, it was a bit of a subterfuge that didn't really carry a whole lot of water, but that was their argument. But by 2011, the Somali pirates were threatening all the way down to the Mozambique Channel, way up to Oman, across almost near India. This was a big, big, big issue. The African leaders did not have a response to this. And this is the reason why I'm bringing this up. Africa did not have a plan to tackle piracy. They had neglected the maritime dimension of security. So they didn't have a plan. They basically just sat there waiting for the international community to come and rescue. It was the international community, the much maligned international community, that came to Africa's rescue. When this issue started, some of the African leaders went to the international community and requested assistance, including to the United States. Take it from me. The first thing the United States will always ask you is, do you have a plan? Because the assumption is that you know your environment. You study your environment better than anybody. When you see a problem coming, you'll have a plan on how to respond. The answer was, well, we don't have a plan. We don't have a plan. The AU didn't have a strategy. None of the RECs had a strategy. Not ECOWAS, not ECAS, not SADC, not EAC, not the Maghreb. Nobody had a plan. At the national level, very few countries had a maritime strategy. Very, very few. So they didn't know how to respond. The international community responded through, among other things, Operation Atalanta. Let me ask you a question. How many ships, how many African ships participated in Operation Atalanta? Anybody? This is to deal with piracy off the coast of Africa. How many African ships? 10? Somebody said 10? 0. That's the right answer, 0. Now, the pirates in East Africa, I think they're on vacation. They're on holidays. You don't see too many, you don't hear too many pirate attacks off the Horn of Africa. Thanks to the international community, they're on holidays now. But they'll come back. Trust me, they will come back. On the other side of Africa, piracy is on the rise. The Gulf of Guinea, infested with pirates, completely infested. Mainly, well, I will not, everybody knows the origin of the pirates, but I won't mention any names. They're posing a massive security problem in the Gulf of Guinea. The Gulf of Guinea is one of those areas of Africa that's really central. This is one of the key areas. If you're going to project Africa's development into the future, one of the main anchors of that development will be the Gulf of Guinea. Massive resources, tremendous economic dynamism. But all of that is being threatened by piracy and armed robbery at sea. I think that it's important that African leaders pay attention to that and find measures to deal with that. And if I have the time, I'll come back to those measures in a minute. Just giving you some figures there on the anti-shipping activities, and you see that is the Gulf of Guinea, two areas of Africa, the Gulf of Aden, but that has subsided quite a bit. In the Gulf of Guinea, you see major increases. And then the other issue that we have to deal with is terrorism, maritime terrorism. This is a big concern. Whether we're talking about the attack on vessels, whether we're talking about attacks on oil platforms, especially in the Gulf of Guinea, and also the potential use of the ocean as a conduit for terrorist devices. Now, the international community has responded vigorously and in a very robust way in the Horn of Africa. The African countries are, although belatedly, they're taking some very important measures to begin the process, the long and I will say very complex process of ensuring that Africa's maritime domains are protected. This work is being done basically at three levels. It's being done at the continental level, at the regional level, and at the national levels. The AU just produced a very ambitious strategy. It's called AIM 2050. That's the Africa Integrated Maritime Strategy 2050. In fact, I was only half joking with my brother who was in charge of putting together the strategy. I said, look, we got problems right now. Why 2050? It's important to have a long-term vision, but it's also important to have action plans to deal with issues right now. But it's a very good document, but it's an aspirational document. It's an aspirational document. We can talk about this in greater detail if you wish. But a lot of the good work is being done at the regional level. The United States government has been following very closely what's taking place, especially on the Atlantic side of Africa, where ECAS and ECOWAS are working together to achieve maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea. This is a process that started a few years back, around 2008, 2009. And the origin of the problem, I'll just take a couple of minutes to dwell on this. The origin of the problem was you had one particular country in ECOWAS creating many problems. And some of these problems were reaching the ECOWAS countries. So because the ECOWAS countries did not really want to confront this problem directly, the decision was made, and they made the wise decision that it was the two regional entities that really should handle the problem. And what they've done was something very original, and is beginning to bear fruit. They organized themselves, and they decided to draft a memorandum of understanding that would enable both regions to work together. Very, very innovative. In addition to that, now what they've done is to divide the entire region into maritime zones. Understanding that no country can handle even their own maritime problems alone, they organize themselves into maritime zones. And each one of these maritime zones, the idea is that they will work together to pursue maritime security. So far, I think, in my own view, if you ask me, the one that's working the best right now is Maritime Zone D, which includes Gabon, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, and São Tomé. That is basically operational. That is to say, they work together, each contributing some assets, and they are pursuing patrols over their maritime zone. Another zone that is beginning to work very well is Maritime Zone E in ECOWAS. And that includes Nigeria, Togo, Benin. Niger, of course, is landlocked, but Niger is also part of that zone. And that particular zone is doing very, very well, and has been able to keep a lot of the piracy at bay, so to say. There's also increasingly some work being done at the national level. At the national level, countries are beginning to put together national maritime strategies. And the real interesting thing is that many of these strategies, they really focus on the nexus between maritime security and development. If you read some of these strategies that are being drafted, they really capture the importance of the sea, not just for security, but also for development. But a lot more needs to be done. All the littoral African countries should have a maritime strategy that integrates, that builds on the regional strategies that build on and support the continental strategy. My time is up. I will be sitting down, and I will be happy to entertain any questions or comments you may have. Thank you very much for listening.